one very big thing in sustainability is we look at the kind of triple bottom line of economic sustainability, environmental, and social. But we overlook the worldview that informs everything that we do quite often. When you look at this worldview and you start to realize that the way we design buildings and the way we set briefs is based on a predetermined assumption of what that looks like, of how that operates.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone, welcome to the podcast. October has blown into London bringing wet and stormy weather, and now I have a sore throat, so I apologise if my voice sounds a bit weird at the moment. I'm sure I'll get over it in a few days. Today's episode is a conversation with Scott McAulay. Scott is an activist, an architectural designer, educator and writer. Disgruntled with the lack of focus on sustainability and climate change within architectural education, Scott began the Anthropocene Architecture School, which fuses education, climate literacy and sustainable design, utilising activist media strategies and educational workshops to catalyse and support responses to the climate and ecological emergency from within the construction industry. Now, if you're thinking, what the hell does all that mean? He's going to explain that in the episode, so keep listening. It's really, really interesting, the work that he's doing, and I really, really like his approach. He's the kind of person that even speaking to him for a full hour doesn't seem like nearly long enough. We could have happily spoken for all day about various things. He's really, really passionate about what he's doing and really knowledgeable as well. In this episode, we talk about his approach to education and why traditional architectural education is failing students, the importance of unlocking people's imagination and agency to create a better future, and also concepts like regenerative design and degrowth and what that would mean for the built environment. If you're enjoying the Green Urbanist podcast, you can support it in two ways. First of all, please leave a review, a written review or just 5 stars, whatever your podcast platform allows, particularly on Apple Podcasts, because that helps it get recommended to other people. Also, if you enjoy an episode, I bet you have a friend or a colleague who would also enjoy it. So please do forward it on to them and spread the word. That's what will really help the podcast keep growing. And finally, before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to share a recommendation for an interesting and free learning course. Seeing as we're talking about a lot about education this episode, I've been in touch with Jonas from the Transforming Urban Mobility Initiative, and they have a free 4-week online course in collaboration with University College London called Introduction to Transport Planning for Sustainable Cities. It's available at a website called Future Learn, which you can find in a link in the episode description. They're doing really interesting work and have been kind enough to add the Green Urbanist to their podcast library, which is like a resource for people to find relevant podcasts about sustainable urbanism and transportation. So I just wanted to give them a shout out here. I think it's really important that all of us working towards in sustainability and education help each other out and collaborate in this way. And actually, this is something I talked to Scott about in this episode. So for now, please enjoy my conversation with Scott. Welcome, Scott McAulay, to the Green Urbanist podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you very, very much for having me.
Pleasure. Please introduce yourself to the listeners. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you do.
I'm Scott, he, him, and I'm a climate justice activist first and foremost. But I work in architecture, climate literacy, and started the Anthropocene Architecture School project kind of 2 years ago to really protest architecture as an action towards climate change. And that's now developed into Anthropocene Project CIC, which is a much bigger scaling up of trying to deliver that learning as fast as possible, because the house is literally on fire and we're not moving fast enough.
That I love that title, the Anthropocene Architecture School, because it's sort of it brings to mind that presumably other architecture education is for an older climate era.
Yeah, it's also a great. I chose the I'd heard the word repeatedly for a few years. And then when I was wondering, how can I talk about climate without to architects, without using words green, eco, or climate? Anthropocene was a brilliant icebreaker because everybody asked what it meant. So it was a really good time to explain we are now in this new geological epoch where kind of activities from humans, mostly kind of large fossil fuel corporations, have changed our climate. We are the biggest driver on Earth. And it was the people that got attracted to it weren't just architects. So the word Anthropocene drew in loads of really different, interesting, exciting people who were wondering, why is someone using this word and is this an actual school? Which it kind of is, kind of.
What I mean, well, okay, let's keep talking about education because I mean, presumably you've started this school or this sort of educational platform for a reason. I mean, what is it that's wrong with current architectural education?
So at the moment, and for a very long time, architectural education is not really grounded in reality. So we've had, like, ever since Earth Day and before that, we've known our climate is changing. We need to be living more sustainably. We need to be kind of using less and getting more out of it. But architectural education hasn't caught up. It's still kind of designing in isolation. If sustainability is taught, it's usually token, if taught at all. In some spaces, in some places, that's different. I will say straight away before I insult someone. But in most spaces, I've seen sustainability in architectural education is token. It's a tick box exercise, if it's done at all. And students are being prepared. Well, they're not being prepared for a future in which we are facing climate breakdown. We are going to have to be delivering far more efficient buildings. We're going to have to be doing far less damage to the planet. We've got a really, really small carbon budget, but they're still kind of teaching and educating as if it's kind of like the 1970s. And that's alongside a studio culture, which is incredibly unhealthy and sets up a working practice, which is inherently very unhealthy. It is just not preparing students. So when I was in university, I was always wondering, why am I not being taught how to design properly sustainable buildings in a very detailed and practical way? So I kind of, not as everyone, as some people might do, I decided to go and look for, can I do some of these buildings? So I went and looked for opportunities to kind of work on sites. So I worked on a hempcrete project in the French Alps. I did some straw bale building in Exeter. And I took courses and these kind of things, just so I really wanted to expand the knowledge and I really wasn't getting from my education, which was just it was a real shame because I found out post leaving architecture school, I really loved to learn, but I just wasn't given the opportunity to learn about this in that education in those 5 years in university.
That's brilliant. And that learning by doing thing is something that is so missing from a lot of university syllabus.
Oh yeah, like there's nothing teaches you how a structure stands up, like working on it for a few weeks and seeing things get added to it and starting to build a wall. So you understand how detailing works. It's no longer just a drawing on a page, but I admittedly still do have the drawing of the first building I worked on, just that one cross section of the wall. And it's all in French, but I can still remember what everything is. And it's a fantastic way of building up that understanding. And students sadly just don't get that. So we have students going through, I've had students ask me what retrofit means. Students have asked me, what do I put in a wall?
Wow.
So they've not been told what materials actually go in a wall. And that's incredibly worrying. And they really should be being prepared for their future. So lots of the work that I've kind of done is I create the spaces to learn. So I'll bring in people who won't necessarily get places to teach in universities. So I'll get sustainability consultants, passive house designers, natural builders, activists, eco builders, engineers, and then students can ask them any question they want to. So instead of it being that kind of very quite hierarchical kind of space where you can't ask questions without feeling kind of embarrassed or a bit shamed by it. Whenever I create a space, there's no stupid question. We set the tone immediately. You can ask absolutely anything about your project, about buildings, about anything else, just to inform that project. And when you create that kind of space, students flourish and thrive and really enjoy just asking how things work. And that kind of technical side, they're not really getting very well. They can ask people who are actually doing it. And that's quite exciting for students. One person said they learned more in 15 minutes than they had in 2.5 years, which is so far a personal record. And it's just being able to make those spaces fun again. Like, education should be fun. If it's not fun and it's not teaching you about your future, then it's fundamentally failing.
Is there an idea that you'll learn the technical stuff on the job, and university is there more to teach you the concepts and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that has become sort of expected, I think, by on some courses. They kind of hope that students get prepared enough that buildings will stand up, that they can go through and they can graduate. But yeah, I've even found myself just even working with students quite a lot, they don't understand how these things work because they've not been taught them fully. And it depends what kind of practice you're working in, because not all practices are doing sustainable architecture at the moment. So we've got people.
That's the thing, yeah.
Yeah,
most are not, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. I'll agree with that very, very, very enthusiastically. We need to be doing far more sustainable buildings, and we need building regulations that guarantee it, not just the occasional challenge or voluntary sort of scheme. Because with the building regulations we have, people are legally allowed to build on floodplains. They're still allowed to build inefficient buildings. Embodied carbon is not regulated. We have all these massive holes in our building regulations. And yeah, architectural practices, we do have a long way to go, but that's not an insult or a bad thing. We've got a lot of learning we can be doing together and sharing and looking at best practice, who's done what before. And that's the kind of, there's a huge opportunity presented by responding to this appropriately and like urgently if we do so. And we create these bases to share. We can, instead of having to do everything from scratch, we can be supporting each other, and nobody needs to start from square one anymore. That should not be happening. And if we can create a culture in architecture where nobody starts from square one because everyone is supporting everyone and we're learning from each other, we can respond to this appropriately of the right, correct magnitude. But at the moment, it's still quite kind of me in my corner with my detailing and my Revit library that I don't want to share with anyone. When why do that? Like, everything is on fire. Your Revit library and kind of stuff is not important. We really need to be treating this as an emergency. And that does mean deviating from traditional practice.
It's worth, I suppose, flagging up, as you said, that it's not just architects. We love. I'm a planner by background, so we love complaining about architects. But it's not just the architects; it's also the planning system, the building regulations.
Oh yeah,
have a long way to catch up. And the British planning system, the English planning system, is very unique in terms of how flexible it is. I'm sure it's similar in Scotland, where you can make an argument for building on a floodplain. You're like, what kind of argument could there be for building on a floodplain? And also I've seen local planning policies that say things like any development that achieves a passive house standard will be regarded, positively. And you're like, well, that's incredibly weak. That means no one has to do it, So we need to be much stronger on these things.
Oh, definitely. And a lot of that is the kind of education is so important, not just for the people doing the professional side, because if we're going to try and argue for any of these big changes, we need to have the public on side. We cannot say we're going to retrofit every single home in the country and we're not going to tell you why, because that's going to get kickback. But in Scotland, we did the Scottish Climate Assembly, where they found out when you use kind of direct democracy and you teach people all the facts in an unbiased way, and you say, what should we be doing in terms of, say, retrofitting the housing stock? And they say by 2025, we should have retrofitted all social housing. By 2030, all housing. Wow. So that's 100 people with no guaranteed background in the built environment. And that's what happens when you teach people and you share it, and it's more direct. People feel they have a part to play. So, but at the same time, last year, 64% of the British public did not know what net zero meant. They had never heard of it before in their lives. So we've got this huge kind of gap in communications. So it's, on one hand, we've got the delivering it in practice. How do we do that? Then it's how do we enable and transform our planning system, our building regulations, to actually make this happen. So we do need things like kind of whole life carbon has to be regulated. That's no longer an option. That's on how soon, not a what if. And then we need things like maintenance cycles. We need it to be mandatory to maintain your buildings. We can't have landlords letting housing be kind of going into the ground just so they can make some money from it. And then on top of that, you need the public and the politicians making decisions to actually be informed. So we really do have to look at all those different levels. And then supply chains delivery. It's a huge, complex issue, but without educating people to understand why it's important, And it's not this kind of hyper topic that's so impenetrable that you can't understand it. You can understand it if you're taken through it, and you can ask questions, and you can flag that up, and you can have the space to respond to it, because quite often we don't have the space to kind of emotionally process what's happening, or to talk about it, or to articulate it. So that's one thing that I do regularly try and bring up and bring in, and just kind of to get people to have a space where they can comfortably talk about what their response is. Because when I've seen this in practice, I did a talk in Edinburgh where we had about 100 landscape architects in a room. And I just kind of, as like a bit of a test, said, okay, how many people here, raise a hand, if you've ever like articulated how you feel about climate change in a public place or to someone else. And we got 6 really nervous hands going up, like looking around the room, like wondering, should I do this? And then I said, okay, for the next 5 minutes, I would like you to talk to your neighbour and to actually like reflect upon this, just bounce off each other. How do you feel when you think about climate change? And it got to 5 minutes and I almost lost control of the room entirely. We had to kind of like, thankfully didn't have to shout because of microphones, but people just hit a nerve immediately. And people found, I've never had to talk about this before. And it feels like a release. I've not had this. And it's like, oh my God, there's 94 people in a room of 100 who've never had that space. And that's a huge thing. If you're going to be making decisions, or if you're going to feel confident enough to kind of challenge a client, your boss, if you're still not able to articulate how it makes you feel, or you've not engaged with those feelings in a meaningful way, that's quite difficult. And lots of activists do this. It's a very, very common thing in activist spaces to really engage with those feelings in a positive way to kind of start working through them. But for a lot of people, that's not commonplace yet. So I always try to put a little gentle, safe space like that into workshops to give people a space to, usually anonymously. I usually use a word cloud. So it means that it fills the screen with all the things that people are feeling without anyone having to stand up and say it. And just so people can see they're not the only people feeling this. So that's quite a kind of, it is a little bit of a tangent to go off on, but it's a really important thing about responding to the climate emergency. It's creating the spaces to engage with those feelings in a meaningful way, and not to try and bury everything and to kind of dismiss and discount. And people don't really feel that doomism side if they're able to articulate it. And then they can also see there are opportunities for me to do things. So it's a kind of starting to work for that process sometimes with people.
That's amazing. I think that's so brilliant. And I recently had a psychologist on the podcast who also happens to be my brother, Brian O'Kelly, to talk about climate anxiety and climate despair. And one of the things he was saying is that, you know, you wouldn't, if you were a psychologist, you wouldn't treat climate anxiety the same way you would treat like social anxiety or a fear of heights or something like that, because something like social anxiety or a fear is disproportionate to actually how dangerous or scary the thing is. Whereas climate anxiety, it's actually a totally normal response to something, the thing that is happening, which is so devastating and serious. And so he said, you know, you shouldn't try to get rid of those feelings. What you need to do is try to accept them, try to accept the reality of what's happening, and then find a way for you personally to take some sort of meaningful action. And that will probably be the thing that will help you manage that. But you shouldn't expect it to go away. And I think that first step of giving people a space to actually talk about it and ask people about it and tell them that they're normal and that it's perfectly natural to feel this way. I mean, that's just amazing. Yeah, well done.
Oh, yeah, I brought that in from kind of experience in activist spaces. So when the first IPCC report came out, not the first one. Oh God, that was 30 years ago. That was before me. When 2018's came out and really kind of hit the nail home hard, that was a huge sense of just immediate shock, because I'd always known this is bad, but just be told like within my lifetime, things are going to drastically change, not just drastically change, but if we continue on the path we're on, we're going to be making this problem exponentially worse. And we know it's not a case of we don't know anymore. It's we fully understand, and we have fully understood for 30 years. So I was suddenly hit with, our governments have understood this has been happening for 50 years and choosing to do effectively nothing productive. We've had like the Kyoto Protocol was a fantastic example, which it can happen. Paris was a big step, but we're still waiting to see will people rise to it. But I found getting involved with Extinction Rebellion kind of locally and like where I live, and then kind of beyond that as well, really found that as a really kind of not just cathartic but incredibly regenerative and nourishing to be in a space where you don't feel you're the only person who is scared about this, who is panicking, who is anxious. I was on a course where I think I was the only person in my final degree show who mentioned the IPCC report as part of the influence of my project. And that was out of over 100. And I really felt in that space in architecture school, this is it's really quite isolating. But to be in a group of people who people want to take action, they really are supportive. Everyone I've ever met through activist groups is some of the most supportive people you'll ever meet. The Anthropocene Architecture School was an idea that I had that people kind of encouraged, and people helped find spaces for me to do things. And I took the Anthropocene Architecture School to the Edinburgh Fringe with Extinction Rebellion in 2019, and all sorts of just really. That was where I started to find the kind of that agency that I think that lots of us don't really recognise that we have, and we're not really teaching students that they have so much agency to not just do things in their university, but to do things more broadly, locally, nationally, globally. Even like I can now use the Anthropocene Architecture School as an example. So that's now in 2 years has directly engaged 4,200 people over now. And I've now done talks, lectures or workshops at 16 universities in Europe and Canada, which I didn't set out to do. I set out to protest and kind of kick things into happening. And it's now just kind of grown, and it's taken on a bit of a life of its own as a story, because I'm still occasionally asked, like, is it a school? Like, what does it do? Where is it? Where is it physically based? Which is always kind of makes everyone around me laugh quite a lot. And it's really just, we all have so much agency to just do things. And that's something that our education system hasn't been encouraging, that kind of sense of agency and really cultivating our imagination to do things outside of what we've been taught as social norms. So for setting up a kind of guerrilla school that teaches if the house is on fire, which occasionally does things quite sporadically, instead of doing a kind of when I did part of the RIBAJ Rising Stars and they asked for an image, I gave them a tour poster of the events I'd done instead, and just to really make everything quite playful and provocative. And it just seems to have taken on a life of its own, and it's really quite lovely when students have said, I've came to a workshop and then I'm now helping start up a group in my university. Thank you for doing this. And it's kind of like, I'm not just screaming into a void and occasionally being asked to speak places. Things are happening. This is lovely. But it's having...
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say that I think that's, a similar experience that I've had, which is like talking about something which seems quite niche and something that doesn't get talked about in professional settings, or I guess in universities, but people are latching onto it, and there's obviously this latent interest there that isn't getting fulfilled in more traditional places. Yeah,
I've found that in kind of droves. I did an example I can give was I did a workshop that was supported by Trada, who did their part of their kind of university engagement program. And we basically said, we're going to hold this workshop, and students from any university in the company in the country can basically sign in, and their tutors can come too. So for the first one, we got students from 18 different universities. I was like, wow, this is quite good. Can we? Okay, that's our new record. And I was like, okay, number 2, how big can we push it? So we got 200 staff and students from 46 different institutions. And that's one example. And that's just such that the appetite is huge. And there's people looking for this in so many places.
Yeah.
But it just isn't there. And it just so happens that quite serendipitously, I've started doing this at a time when climate literacy is now it's a very common word. We're going to have mandatory competencies coming in to be an architect. You have to be climate literate to an extent. And this was something that I was using as a word. Excellent. So as to really, when you describe it as a literacy, you're not telling someone you don't know how to do things properly. You're just saying you're missing a fluency in something. So the fluency is in really understanding the practical implications of climate change upon what you do and how what you do can respond positively. And that's it. It's just like setting the scene, starting that kind of learning journey to recognize that we have not prepared people to design, to create objects, spaces, work with the landscapes, and sometimes in a changing climate. And that's okay. We're not insulting people. We're not picking targets. We're just saying, you have not been educated, you have not been prepared for this. And the people who are educating today, many of that which have not been given that same education. So it's this invitation to learn. So whenever I talk about climate literacy, it's never a case of, it's terrible that people are bad at this. It's a case of, there's this huge opportunity to take action on climate change, and you get to learn together. And learning together is so much more fun. It's more satisfying. Most of the learning I've done and the stuff that sticks the most is what I've learned from other people while doing something. So when I was in the design studio in Scotland, or when I studied in Canada, being able to have those conversations with people, and you learn, and that's what sticks in your mind. Or when you're on site and you can ask someone any number of questions about, how does this go together? How would I do this? What are the alternatives? And being able to learn with people is so much more kind of nourishing for everyone. So whenever I talk about the kind of the climate literacy side and how do we bring that into education, it's going to take new methods. It's not going to be a bolt-on. It can't simply be, here is your one climate literacy lecture, you're now going to do everything. It's this kind of continuous thread that has to be woven for everything, as much as sustainability has to be. It's the background. So climate literacy is the context in which we live and how we can respond positively to the climate emergency. And I've brought that in a couple of different ways. So one is what I do workshops for kind of students or practitioners. And that's really, I set the scene. So I set the kind of background context in quite a bit more detail, but just enough to understand all the reports coming out. So people feel they can keep up. So there's just enough science to not feel like a high school science lesson. And there's kind of a little bit of kind of the past few years, this is what things look like. And then from there, you take whatever subject you're talking about, whether that be architecture, the built environment, landscape architecture, trades, and you put it into that context. And you say, this is the impact this has on that context. And then once you've set that, if you've kind of grounded what people are doing here, you say, okay, so here's how you can now respond. Here are existing resources, existing strategies, examples of when people have made this possible, of when they've done this well. So you always end on that kind of, this is what people are doing. And other times I go for all this, and then I take a kind of pause, and then I get people to actually stop and pause and use their imagination to really wonder, what would my day-to-day work and life look like if all these examples were normal, if they were what we were doing, and then to start to chart what is necessary to get us from where we are today to there. And I typically use 2025 as the sort of day, because if you use 2050, people projecting that far into the future, it's not immediate enough for people. But if you're saying, we've got 4 years to transform everything, how can we ambitiously, creatively transform everything in 4 years? So that's the kind of a typical workshop that I do with kind of professionals and students. Another example was when I played it a different way. So I set a project for MSA Live 21 at Manchester School of Architecture. So the brief that I set the students was, I would like you to create replicable and localized climate literacy resources that can be understood by anyone. So you're going to take all of these high-level sustainability concepts, and you're going to make it able to be communicated to anybody who wants to listen, and especially to new students. And we thought, okay, we've asked quite a lot. But at the same time, I brought in Sam Turner, who I now work with at Anthropocene Projects, and he did a climate literacy and carbon literacy workshop with the students over a day to give them the big background grounding. So they spoke about that, and then we brought in Simeon Sputnow from Birmingham as well, and he spoke about engaging with students and how to do other things. And then when the students came back, and I hadn't given them strict parameters. I hadn't said, I want this medium and I want it to look like this. And I said, okay, just come back with whatever you think is the best way to respond to this. And I was greeted by these incredible illustrations that were very beautifully done, but also just explained everything about someone's day-to-day life. So the students' way of doing this wasn't to do like a workshop, it was a narrative. So it was to be able to explain graphically where in the day your life is affected by climate change and how the built environment is the background to that. And it was incredible. That was not in the brief that I set. That was students taking what they believed was the best way to do it and running with it. And then all of a sudden there was these animations that they brought together that they started to teach one another how to do. They built a website, which again wasn't on the brief, but they built a website. And this was just to show how powerful it is to ask students to learn and with a guided output. So that was the second kind of example, and I was blown away by how effective that was, and I cannot take credit. That was entirely off the students' own creativity. And then just recently, well, at the moment, I'm co-leading a team for the School of Reconstruction, and that's a big interreg project being run out of Brighton. And for our every kind of unit is doing a different theme around reconstruction. So what we set as a project, both me and Sam, for Anthropocene project students, we said we would like you to reimagine the infrastructure that has brought us to this point. We'd like you to find some redundant or unloved or unuseful infrastructure and repurpose it in such a way that allows life to thrive in a 2-degree world in 2050. So we set those parameters. Wow, we didn't say we want you to do this specific methodology. We just sat back and said, okay, here's what we'd asked. And the responses that have came back have been mind-blowing. They've been incredible. We've got everything from, one student said yesterday, what if we, instead of responding to kind of flooding and to rising seas with building defences, we realised that we had to move, and we moved seasonally, and we became more kind of nomadic lifestyles happened in a bigger way, in a way that was facilitated nationally by an infrastructure. I was like, wow, this is incredible. We've also got someone looking at the kind of wildfires in Portugal. So in Portugal, it's illegal to have a fire at all anywhere near a forest or a beach. So this is a very good law. It makes sense. But that law also stops them testing controlled burns to see, can we work with the landscape again like we used to do traditionally? So this student's proposal is to reuse infrastructure and use a festival to teach people. So it's an architectural response that is a festival. I ended up bringing up the Beltane Festival as a precedent for them. They're looking at Burning Man and all sorts of different ways of festivals being used as educational devices. And we've got other students looking at unused kind of factory complexes that were kind of built for entire communities. And it's absolutely incredible. They're looking at the impacts on their locality, and they're coming back with responses that are far more exciting than any work I ever did in architecture school. And it's just when you create those spaces and you have that kind of, you give students the freedom to actually reimagine how the world could be, instead of saying, design a solution for this problem. If you kind of somehow give them the kind of the confidence to challenge those norms, if that's provocative, it's provocative. If it's funny, it's funny. If it's playful, it's playful. But to go beyond the worldview we have today. So one very big thing in sustainability is we look at the kind of triple bottom line of economic sustainability, environmental, and social. But we overlook the worldview that informs everything that we do quite often. There's a really, I did not come up with this originally. This was from Designing Regenerative Cultures by Daniel Christian Weil, which is an incredible book that every single designer of anything should read. And when you look at this worldview and you start to realize that the way we design buildings and the way we set briefs is based on a predetermined assumption of what that looks like, of how that operates. So once you start to unpick that and you start to ask more questions, instead of saying, okay, so we want to, for example, instead of saying we want to design a school and it's going to have this many children, it's going to have this many books, we're going to program it, we're going to do it how the schools have been done for the last 10 years. Instead of saying, okay, we're going to do that, we can begin with, how do people learn best? Can we use this building as a teaching device? So in Prague, there's a library that was actually designed by students who won a competition where they used the building to illustrate structural concepts. So the floor is a stress-strain diagram. All of the servicing is exposed, so it can be used as part of lessons. And that's just an example of how to use a building as a teaching device. Or there's the Birchgay School Science Wing, which is a Living Building Challenge certified building. And this is it's a science classroom designed to teach school children science. So it has allotments, it has a green wall inside, it has a rainwater harvesting system that actually flows through the classroom as a river through a recycled fountain where children can do experiments on water in their classroom. And that's incredible. And I always use this example. It's the most love. And the best thing is there's a book about this process. They still have the original sketch that a child drew of wanting a river through the classroom. And they've blended this into the curriculum of how they teach, into how they designed it. And so much incredible things are possible when we create spaces to learn, when we create spaces to live, work, play, build things, create things. And lots of that is going to involve, if we're going to decarbonize kind of the built environment and society, we're going to have to challenge that worldview and start asking things about, do we necessarily need to use this much energy? So you always get the big dilemma thrown up by renewables and fossil fuels. How are we going to meet this demand with renewables? This is not possible. But that does bring you into things like degrowth. So one of my kind of favorite concepts around kind of all of not just design, but all policy, kind of economics. And this is where you're wanting to use less. So there's less extraction, less consumption, less material use. But at the same time, you're reducing inequality and raising well-being. So it's this really good coverall concept that recognizes that economic growth is not a measure of all that's good in the world. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's also, you're recognizing that systems have limits, and that's natural, that's okay. In nature, most systems do not exponentially grow. Nothing can exponentially grow forever. There's usually a point where it cuts off. Because like at the moment, every kind of 23 years, the world economy is expected to double in size on a planet which doesn't double in productive capacity and regenerative capacity. So we're faced by this kind of an economic system that's not grounded in reality, that is entirely dependent upon sacrificial life, landscapes, and communities. So it's a real kind of challenging the worldview and designing for a more kind of regenerative future, and one that does not depend on fossil fuels, does not depend on externalities going kind of unaddressed as well.
I think I was thinking recently that something we need to be doing much more of in this sort of educational space is asking people to develop a vision or to imagine what their life and their world could look like in 2030, 2050. Because I think a lot of the sticking points of taking drastic action on climate change is around, how can I keep my lifestyle or the way the world works the same, but in a decarbonized way? And in a sense, that's the wrong question to ask. What we should be asking is, how can we make things different, i.e. better in most cases, but certainly different, in a decarbonized world using these different energy sources. Is that something you try and do with students?
Oh, as often as possible. So very often create what we did for an exercise, actually just yesterday, was instead of saying to our students, we want to do a kind of a practice exam, what we said was, we want you to tell the story of your project in 2050. So we want you to take us on a journey from where we're starting today, what are the issues, then go to how are you addressing them, and then what is the world like when that's working. And to create the spaces, because I realized during a lecture I was giving, I realized I'd never been asked to use my imagination in architecture school. At no point did anyone use the word imagination, which is absolutely incredible.
That's incredible.
For a profession in which you're kind of encouraged to create the future, to design the future, we are not asking students to use their imagination to ask big questions. And I found that when you give those students the space to ask those big questions and to see like what is actually necessary. So if we are going to decarbonize anything, and if we are going to hit any climate target, we have to decarbonize the built environment, because that's about 40% of carbon emissions. So if we try and do decarbonization strategies that don't recognize this, we're only tackling 60% of the emissions. So it's asking people, how can we do this in such a way that it's looking after people, it's regenerating the environment. It's actually, we're living more in tune with the natural world, because at the moment, what we do when we design buildings is we draw this opaque line between us and nature and say nature is separate from us. We do not want nature indoors. We want this really closed environment. It's going to be closed. It'll be efficient. It'll be super energy efficient, but it's not going to really blend with nature. It's not going to embrace that. Where so many cultures for thousands of years have really been fused with nature. They're at kind of intermediary spaces where you're not indoors, you're not outdoors, but you are in nature. And that's another really fantastic concept as regenerative design. So that's looking beyond just being sustainable. Because when we talk about sustainability in the built environment, we're actually talking about aiming for doing zero damage. We're talking about damage control. We're talking about how can I deliver this building?
It's the bare minimum.
Yeah, it's the barest of bare minimums. It's kind of conventional practice as the legal bare minimum that you won't get sued for. And then sustainability is a little bit of a step up. And that's where you think you're doing things a bit, but you are doing things better. And that's fantastic. But you're aiming for that zero. So kind of net zero is that kind of, you're aiming for zero. And if you can't hit it, you're going to try and offset that somewhere else. But at the same time, we should really be aiming above zero. So our baseline should not be zero. If we look at regenerative design practices, you're looking at developing where we're co-evolving with nature. You're designing buildings that are good for their environment. They give things back. They don't require this huge input of energy. They might use materials, for example, that are better for the environment. So lots of these high-tech sustainable buildings are still using an incredible number of toxic materials. So we can actually design that out as well. If we look at more regenerative design practices, we're involving more of the design team earlier. So we are not just kind of developing a concept and then bringing people on to make it work. We are co-designing this. We are inviting more people in to contribute. We're taking the time to reflect upon what we're designing. And one really good example is the Living Building Challenge. So this sort of makes BREEAM and LEED look as if they are good things, but this is like the big jump up, the kind of current kind of high standard. And this is where you're saying that buildings have to be designed with the metaphor of a flower in mind. So they've got to be net positive in energy use. They have to be net positive in water use. So they have to actually recycle, capture, deal with all of their own water. They cannot send that away. And then you're saying all the materials have to be non-toxic for all species. So it means that you cannot use materials that are going to have kind of toxic runoff anywhere in their supply chain. You can't use materials that are unsafe for builders to work with. And then you've got lots of other parts of the standard that are also non-negotiable. So you don't get a sticker for trying. You get your kind of plaque at the end for demonstrating for a year that your building hits this really high standard. And so every single one of these buildings is actually an incredible story of a difficult design process that had challenges that had to be overcome, but they're sort of like a pioneer species. So once one of them has been built in a locality, in a country, it proves it's possible. So in the UK, we have one of these so far. And so that now means that nobody can say the standard's impossible to achieve, which in itself is incredibly powerful and very useful to know as well.
Where is the building, if you know off the top of your head?
Oh, this is the Curedon Valley Park Visitor Centre. It was designed by Strawworks, and it was built with some support from the School of Natural Building, who did some courses with people as well. And it's a straw bale building. Excellent. And it's incredible. It's a really beautiful example of what's possible when you work with the landscape and you set high standards and you build with materials that are healthy, that store carbon and lock that away. And it's just a really lovely example as well.
Brilliant. I guess it might be fair to ask you, as we said, you ask your students what's your sort of vision for the future. Do you have an idea, an image in mind of how you would like the world to look in like, we'll say 2050, or you can say sooner if you prefer.
Okay, I would say that by 2025, I would like to be able to just kind of walk out my front door and see national retrofit programs taking place. There will always be people working on buildings. I would say for the next 10 years, there would be people working on buildings. We would have had more kind of direct democracy. So to make this happen, we would have realized that the way our politics functions, it doesn't work with the people and the planet's interest in mind. So we would have given more power to people, to citizens' assemblies, to deliberate on what is necessary. When it came to kind of building regulations, we would have realized that we have to regulate embodied carbon. We cannot simply have that to be an added thing. And on top of that, there would have to be a huge transformation in not just how we design, but what we build with. So it's not just a case of just building with timber. We would have linked up agriculture and construction, and we'd be taking these materials such as kind of straw and hemp and wood fibers, and we'd be using them to fulfill the needs of retrofitting housing and building new housing. So we also currently live in a housing crisis that's really precarious because of things like COVID. There have been lots of these kind of structural inequalities, insecurities have been brought to light. So if we're going to tackle these, we're going to have to start having conversations about how are we going to support people? How are we going to support people whilst using less? So there would be kind of a 4-day working week has been shown by research to make people happier, but also more productive, and also kind of lower the carbon emissions associated with them working. So my kind of probably the big vision would be that we realize that the kind of the moonshot, not the moonshot solution, more like the moonshot aim is to go for a Green New Deal that puts people's well-being and the planet's well-being at its core. So really going for all these things, everything at once. It's not a case of one silver bullet. I would really hope that in the future we recognize that it has to be a little bit of everything all at the same time, and that to really have that as an educational endeavor. So if we're going to achieve this, if my vision of this Green New Deal that decarbonizes our built environment, that rewilds our landscapes, that tackles the kind of the ownership of landscapes, because land ownership is a massive block to climate action. So if we're going to do this, there would have to be a very big kind of public engagement and education program. We'd have to have the same way that films like A Plastic Ocean and Blue Planet 2, they kind of laid out problems and they laid out a couple of solutions at the end. There is this incredible film called Tomorrow, it's Hors Demain in French, and it shows people doing different things in different parts of the economy all around the world to just take action on climate change, whether it be through education, through economics, through foods, through politics, through energy. And I would imagine that film being expanded to include kind of the built environment, to include design, to include urban planning, and to be able to just to show people in ways that to show what's already happening. So I would really hope that by 2025, we've become amazing storytellers. So we started to show these examples of what's possible. Instead of flagging up reasons why we can't do things, we need to be, when we're making a demand, when we're campaigning, we need to be bringing in the stories of when it's been done already, because so many of these things have been done, they are possible. So we need to be showing what's possible. And I'd say being more playful with it as well and provocative. I found that with the work of the Anthropocene Architecture School, design doesn't really have a stock response for someone who's provocative, theatrical, or playful. People know how to respond to seriousness, they know how to respond to philosophy, but when someone is coming out with really big statements that are accompanied actually by some research which proves they're true, and also just being quite theatrical in language, they don't know how to respond. People are quite thrown back. I've got a background in performance as much as architecture, so I always bring in that kind of everything has to be a little bit of it does have to be a performance, but we're going to get better at that. And I think that there's a huge movement, especially amongst kind of younger people. We saw the skill strikes for climate. We saw thousands and thousands of not just children, but young people spearheading this and doing what is necessary and using the power that they have, albeit limited. Unfortunately, they don't all have voting rights yet. But I would really hope that that sort of energy, the energy and the kind of the dynamic creativity of people and growing up is given the space to flourish. And we start to embed, not just embedding climate in education, but embedding the possibilities and the imagination, really breaking away from this reductionist, structured, tested to within an inch of its life, and made learning fun. I think if we're going to hit that 2025 goal that I have in mind, learning has to become fun, enjoyable, accessible, and it has to be inclusive as well. So that's probably an incredible tangent for many things, but that's kind of where I think we should be heading.
And as you said, I mean, with your example of giving those students a brief that really captured their imagination and got them to be really creative and think of things that don't exist yet. I mean, that's the kind of thing that can happen when you engage people and teach them about things that are they're actually interested in and that they're passionate about and that are actually useful and timely. So absolutely. I would say something as well that I would this goes beyond the built environment, I suppose, but something I would like to see is the economic incentives changing around sustainable behavior. Like, for instance, one example is often it's much cheaper to fly from London to Edinburgh than it is to get the train. And you just think, well, what am I supposed to do as a consumer? Do I pay double just so I can have the, more environmentally friendly option? It's, you can't expect people to do that. And, there's also things about, a housing crisis. We've had a housing crisis for the last 10 years, at least, in this, in Great Britain and Ireland. That's a political choice to have that. It doesn't necessarily happen by accident. There are policies in place. There's a planning system in place that has allowed that to happen, and the political class are kind of allowing it to keep going. So I would like to see us. I suppose what it means is a total culture shift and a mindset shift to say, actually, letting large corporations, large developers, large airline companies to rake in the profits is not our priority anymore. Our priority is to allow people to live low carbon lifestyles that are very high quality. And that means a total shift in mindset and a shift of all the incentives as well.
Oh, absolutely. Even to use an example just from last year, it came out that the UK government spent 13 times more on its military than it did on reducing emissions. So the priorities there are incredibly skewed. But if we can change that, change the mindset, change the culture of we're going to subsidize fossil fuels, we're going to, we really need things where at the moment this housing crisis is a choice. Like, as you said, it's the system working as designed. It's not a system that's actually run away from us.
Yeah.
The people making the profits are still making the profits. And there's empty homes here, there, and yonder. There's likely enough empty homes for the people needing homes. And if we can incentivize, instead of building anew, if instead we said, okay, so your challenge as developer, if you want to make money, we want you to go and find buildings to renovate, and we want you to renovate them to a high standard and use as low carbon as possible. So that can be the intermediary step. But at the same time, we need to be empowering communities to take buildings on themselves and to make that accessible to people, because one of the biggest challenges in the UK is that land has a huge value to it. We've got this. Not only has it got a huge value, it's hard to access as well. It's hard to access, and that stops people being able to buy it to build. It even stops people being able to enjoy it, to be able to explore the outdoors, and that's a real problem. We're going to have to change how we look at how we deal with land. Are we going to is it going to be bought back? Is it going to be nationalized? Are we going to simply say you cannot own land? It's a kind of real Western concept, the ownership of land and everything it does. But also that's now expanded to you own the land, but you also get all the benefits that are paid for by other people around it. You get the benefits of the roads that are maintained. You have the benefits of all the kind of the city and the lovely places to visit nearby that give it value. That's not currently seen in how we kind of deal with land or money. But that's why kind of an economics of degrowth and well-being is a really good place to start, because you can't really argue with that. People should be looked after. We should be compassionate towards people when they need help. And when it comes to making decisions about what kind of world we're heading towards and what kind of society we want to have, why is well-being not at the core? Yeah. And surely that is an incredibly easy political platform to run on.
Surely that's something we can all agree on. And yet, I could talk to you all day, Scott, but I'm mindful of the time. Before I move on to the final question, is there any other topics you want to bring up while I have you here?
I think we talked about kind of what degrowth would mean for the built environment. It'd be kind of nice to go there, or...
Okay, great. I suppose that might be nice to expand on that a little bit. This concept of degrowth is obviously a total flip of what we've been chasing the last 100 200 years in terms of our economic thinking, is constant growth at all costs. What would this concept of degrowth, I mean, does that mean that we're living in a recession? Does that mean our quality of life has to reduce, or what would that mean for the built environment?
So for the built environment, degrowth would really mean using materials properly. So to be circularity would be reusing parts of buildings, because at the moment 99% of building components that are used in Northwest Europe are never used beyond one building. We send 99% of them to landfill. So that's incredibly wasteful. But at the same time, it would mean more regular maintenance cycles. It would mean that you'd be kind of legally bound. You would have to be kind of looking after buildings properly. And at the same time as well, that would mean that we'd have to be regulating whole life carbon, not just embodied. We'd have to be looking at whole life, and we'd having to be set much higher building regulations. So our standards would be increasing. And also, if we're going to be using this better, we're going to be changing how we design. It's going to be more lean. We're going to be using less materials in more creative ways. And that's already possible. We'd be using materials that do not have a high carbon footprint. We would be using more natural-based materials that are basically, it's better for your health anyway. So at the moment, numbers say that 40% of all of the money we spend on healthcare in any country is attributable to its built environment. So if we start to look at this as a public health strategy, not just as degrowth strategy, but it's public health, it's climate, it's green jobs, it's this huge transformational opportunity for society. So if we say we must retrofit every single home in the country in a way that's circular, that's healthy, that's low carbon, you're going to have to generate a few million jobs to be very small numbers. And that's an incredibly enticing story for people as well, to say kind of, we're not just going to do this, we're going to guarantee jobs for quite a long time. And there's a really fantastic quote that I use quite often, and it's from Rob Hopkins' book, From What Is to What If. And he says, one of the fundamental challenges is that we need to be able to imagine possible, feasible, delightful versions of the future before we can create them. Not utopias, but where things turned out okay. So we're not imagining this kind of solar punk, everything floats, and the sun powers everything. Things turned out okay. We managed to decarbonize on time, and we did that in a way which looked after people's well-being. So degrowth in the built environment is not just reducing the impact it has, it's becoming stewards of that existing built environment. It's caring for and maintaining the places we have built already. And if that maintenance is not, say, a very good idea, so if there has been lots of towns were built on the coastlines, and as sea level rises as it's going to, some of them are going to, at some point, we're going to have the conversation of how are we going to facilitate an entire town moving away from the sea to kind of retreat from the sea? How can we integrate them somewhere else? So we've got all these impending decisions to make. And unless we embed kind of well-being and degrowth into those decision-making processes, people are going to start being left behind far sooner than we ever expected, in the UK as much as anywhere else. And if we can embed this kind of putting the well-being at the core and ensuring that people understand why you're asking them to do things as well. So when it comes to sustainable design, about between 80 to 90% of the impact of any building or product comes from is already locked in from the design process. So from when you designed it, you've locked in the majority of the damage that's possible. If we could flip that, and to say we're going to push that into positive, it's not going to be damage. We're going to ensure that through design, we are going to ensure that things do environmental good, not harm. Just flip that mindset straight away. So what if, instead of accepting environmental harm in the built environment, we flipped it to aiming for environmental good? And that kind of flipping it with questions and creating that space to be more imaginative. And because when we ask people to simply redesign or to design a solution for a brief that's been set out using the same mindset and the same worldview that got us to here in the first place, you can only get so far doing that. It's when you can kind of decouple from that and say, but what is possible? It's asking what is possible if we do things differently, or if we do things slightly differently. Instead of saying, design a solution for a problem, say, okay, how can we address this and create the conditions for people to thrive at the same time? So just expanding upon what we're asking. So that's also going to be about the design briefs that are set for housing, for hospitals, for every building we do. If we can start to work on the kind of, what are we asking for? what are we asking designers to do?
Yeah.
There's so much opportunity and potential. So that's what kind of gives me energy around responding to the climate crisis. There's in how we design and the processes we have and co-creation, really just in the agency of every single person. There's so much potential and opportunity. And lots of the kind of struggle is going to be tapping into that and really helping people see that they have so much more agency than their education ever told them in the first place.
Right.
And really cultivating that imagination and not diminishing it. Not kind of creativity is so important, but so is the playfulness as well. And when you look at many buildings as they're being kind of about to be built, you see all these kind of renderings without people in them. You see this kind of this perfect kind of reality, which is not as the world is. And if we could start really encouraging architects to use their kind of the architects have the opportunity to project a possible future, to illustrate a possible future. And that's what we need to kind of flip the mindset to. So instead of this kind of star architecture, put a big name on something, can we illustrate and project forward into this more kind of positive, regenerative future? Every single architecture school project is actually an opportunity to do this. Every single end of year exhibition could potentially be over 100 projects imagining a more sustainable world. And there's about 50 architecture schools in the UK.
Yeah.
So if there was 50 exhibitions a year, which all projected this more regenerative world, and we started to kind of look at adaptation, we started to look at not just mitigation, but that would be incredibly powerful as well. And then you start to see the role of kind of museums, of art galleries, of culture. If everyone is kind of projecting forwards and asking people, what if we did things differently? What if the way we do things right now is not the only way we can do things? Because it isn't. There's so many more alternatives as well.
Yeah, it gives me hope that there is so many people over the next 10 years will come into voting age and will come into more senior positions in architectural practices, planning practices, who have this perspective. That could be quite transformational, because I mean it takes time, and maybe we said earlier that when you start as a graduate working in one of these big architecture companies, you don't have much sway to really influence projects. They're probably put you just doing details of toilets and things like, bathrooms and windows and things like that. So it does take a long time before you work yourself up and get yourself into a position. But 10 years time, or by 2025, we could start to see that shift happening.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic way to look at it as well, because I was really excited to see what would happen when we started to get climate strikers in universities, because these are people who are used to using direct action when necessary, to protesting when things are not just, when things require protesting, they've got no qualms about doing it, which I think is incredible. And to see that we've got all these at the moment, we've got there was the rent strikes during COVID, when universities tried to unjustly ask for students to pay for places they weren't there. And you've got all these, you've really got a generation of not just of young people, but people are now seeing all the biggest changes have been facilitated by a mass mobilization of people. And as we get to that kind of tipping point of the generational moving between positions of power in kind of politics and kind of design companies and planning departments, that's going to be a very big shift. And it's not going to be a sudden shift. It's sadly going to be gradual, which is a bit frustrating. But it's just to see that as things move along, there is such a potential. And as we even in just showing people that they have agency, they need not simply do things as they always have. You can break from a pattern of behaviors. You can break from a lifestyle. You can change course, change trajectory. So let's change the story from you go to school, you go to university, you graduate, you go into a job. It's no, you go to school, then your trajectory is your own choice. It is not a case of you just go through a system as has been designed. We start to encourage that choice of trajectory, because if you look at, when you think about it, every single job, every single piece of the economy has the potential to be a climate job. Every single one. So whether you are repairing infrastructure, whether you're setting planning laws, whether you're designing, whether you're working in care, whether you're feeding people, whether you're growing food, whether you're rewelding landscapes, the list just goes on. It goes on through the medical profession, it goes through the arts. Everything has the potential to be positively impacting that culture change. And that's exciting. And that could really use a lot of amplification in space. And just to show people you have the agency to make a change using what you love to do, using what you're passionate about. And that again is really exciting, because when you give people the space to let their passion really flourish, the results are fantastic. They're incredible. They're quite inspiring. And yeah, that's what gives me a fair bit of hope. Just the seeing as people realize they do have agency, and to be supported by people who've done that in the past. So we are not seeing the first ever climate protests. Earth Day was 50 years ago, and there's been several thousand since. And yeah, hopefully we do get things like recently there's a really big push in America and in the UK for a Green New Deal. And that's a story that is yet to really be felt in design professions, in schools, in all professions. So yeah, I hope these kind of new narratives give us a bit of a chance to change course.
Yeah, it's also, I think, just for people thinking personally, like, what's my role in this? What can I do? I think for a long time, the narrative on personal action was stop eating meat, try not to drive so much, take less holidays. It's actually, you're just chipping away at the problem there. That's not the transformation we need. What we need is for you, whoever you are, use your talents and your sphere of influence, no matter how small, to, create a transformation. And that will be different for every person, but you can use your creativity, use your imagination, and use your passion to create a much more positive impact than just trying to stay as small and as insignificant as possible.
Yeah, like even just a kind of a closing example, I found that through the work of through starting the Anthropocene Architecture School, I found out I'm very good at creating spaces for people to share, to learn, and to take action. So that's kind of grown across the last 2 years. But what I'm doing quite soon is I'm pulling together Scotland's first ever People's Assembly on climate and housing justice. So I'm using my kind of ability and sphere of influence to be able to pull together as many people as possible and to support a coalition of trades and tenants unions to all come to the table to start to talk about the policy we need to enact these big shifts. And that's something I would never have imagined I'd be doing 2 years ago. But that's what's possible. I do not have huge capital and huge means, but through the spaces that I've moved through and the connections I've cultivated, I've just been able to have this. I suggested the idea when I was approached by a friend in a climate fringe, and they said, that's fantastic, we'll see what we can do. And now I'm able to use my own connections in architecture, my connections in building, and then just to pull as many people to the table and to have this kind of in-person and online people's assembly to give people the chance to share, to learn from each other, to start to develop what sorts of changes do we need. And I am one person. I am not, and anyone can start doing, it doesn't have to be huge. It can be just starting small, but that really, I cannot stress enough to everyone I speak to. It's just, you have so much agency to do things differently than they are done at the moment. And whether that's bucking the sort of pattern of things, yes, it might be changing your diet. It might be kind of deciding, I want to travel more actively. I want to try and slow down. It might be, I want to shift into really chasing what I'm passionate about, and to how can I find a way of supporting this shift and of supporting those around me. I've got lots of friends who they're incredibly good at kind of all sorts of arts, music, and all sorts, but they're the ones who come to protests and perform and support people and keep the spirits up. Everyone has a different role in that huge, big social change. And it need not be the person holding the banner. It need not be the person standing on top of the boat. It could be just turning up, supporting people, communications, writing, speeches, singing. there's I could talk about this forever. This is sort of like, besides architecture and building, the incredible, incalculable potential of people is something that gives me so much hope.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's beautiful. I have a final question. I have a feeling you've answered this already, but I will ask it anyway, just to give you a chance to have maybe a final word, which is, we're at this pivotal moment in terms of taking action on climate change. From your perspective, what needs to happen or change over the next, usually I say come in decade, but for you, I'll say next 4 years.
Okay. Right. I think over the next 4 years, we really need to see that that narrative shift. We need to see the embracing of the agency that people have, but also I think just that whole creating the space for the imagination. We need to be reimagining things and not just tweaking at the edges, but to really invite bold creativity. But also we need to be changing how we take action. We need to see coalitions of groups, movements of movements. And I think that's the whole breaking out of it. I always talk about breaking out of your silo in the built environment, but this goes for every single sphere of influence. Try to step into another one. Try to overlap. Look for the overlaps and cultivate coalitions beyond those that you would typically work with or no. So reach out. So that's the three big things. First is the seeing that agency and really noting that changes are possible on a grand scale. So even to look at the New Deal in America, where they guaranteed jobs for people and transformed the country. So as far as that, a Green New Deal could be what we need. We need this we need to start tying together different problems. So we need to show that the climate, housing, jobs, healthcare, they're all inseparable. We need to be showing this as a holistic, and we also need to be more imaginative. So solar panels are great, but we can do more. We can imagine living sustainably when it's not just solar panels everywhere. We can imagine it to be beautiful, exciting, fun. And then, coalitions as well. Cannot stress that last one enough. Just reaching beyond our spaces. We need to, once we have the comfort to approach other people, to cultivate those relationships, and really that solidarity with what's happening to people on the front lines of climate change, because the climate emergency is not new. It did not suddenly surprise us. There have been impacts affecting people for decades, if not centuries. And it's really that whole, it is hard to sum up in words. But I think there is that real unmeasurable potential of human beings. And especially when we work together and we co-create things, we definitely have the potential to tackle this head on in a way that raises people's well-being and looks after people at the same time.
It's been one of the great realizations for me running this podcast is just how open people are to talking about the things that they're working on, the things that they're passionate about. And I would never have been confident enough to just message someone on LinkedIn and say, oh, I see you're posting about this kind of thing. I find that really interesting. Do you want to have a chat about it? Whereas that's basically all I do in my spare time now. is I chat to people about stuff they're doing. So I would just say to people, try to work on allow yourself to reach out to people and to find interesting people. If there's someone you want to chat to, they will probably be very open to discussing and collaborating. It's a very collaborative space, I think, the sustainability, climate change.
I'm consistently bowled over. My favorite example was when I ran the Crisis Studio project back in 2019 and 2020, when it was possible to have in-person events. I just put out a call out and said, I am looking for people who are willing to donate time to teach students who want to learn about sustainability. And I got overwhelmed with responses. And I had more people. I had to say to people, can you do the next one? Because I have almost I think we definitely have enough, but I'm so touched that you reached out. And that was the start of actually really, really incredibly good working kind of relationships and learning from people and opportunities to do different things. And that was all because I simply said, like, I created an opportunity for people to engage with, to share what they're good at. And I had so many people get in touch about it, and it was incredible. And when it came to like making that possible, people were just so ready to come back with suggestions and here's how we can make it better. And that just grew into over 100 students came to that across 4 different occasions. And there was hundreds of, we wouldn't even call them tutorials because we realized that if we made it formal, you kind of put people off a wee bit. But it was just so lovely that in asking, all I did was raise a hand and say, I could use some help with this. Is anyone interested? And the kind of the support that's there for everything, the support I've had for the Anthropocene Architecture School has been incredible. And it's not always came from close to home or locally. It's came from all around the world. And I never expected that there would be an article in Time that would open with me comparing going to architecture school was like the Wizard of Oz and realizing nobody knew what they were doing. But here we are.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. People are so open and it's fantastic.
Scott, it's been a real pleasure having you on and having this chat. I've really, really enjoyed it. Where can people find out more about you online?
Online, probably easiest way to reach out is probably on LinkedIn. But if you go onto the Anthropocene Architecture School's Patreon, there is kind of lots of updates, and I try to pull together as many different things that I've done as possible there. And from there, there's the Anthropocene Architecture School's Instagram and Twitter. And then there's the Anthropocene Architecture School Library. That is an Instagram account that has about 100 different resources from all different places. So if you want to learn about anything I've been talking about, there's about a 99% chance it's from a book that I read that's in that library as well.
Great. And I guess people can find a contact there for events you're doing or to, bring you in to do events, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, all that will be in the podcast description, so people can check that out straight away. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.